In July 2012, 4 men drove deep into the Siberian wilderness on what they claimed was a fishing trip. Months later, only 2 walked out alive, starving, frostbitten, and carrying human flesh in their packs. One of their companions had been beaten to death and butchered with an axe. The 4th man was never seen again. This is the story of how greed, desperation, and the unforgiving Siberian wilderness turned hunters into cannibals, and how one of them escaped justice for a decade. Alexei Gorulenko wasn't just any outdoorsman. He was a former local political figure and businessman from Volsk, a man with connections and influence. His childhood friend, Andrei Kurochkin, shared his passion for adventure and the promise of easy money. In the summer of 2012, they decided to head to the remote Sutom River in Russia's Far East. They told people they were going fishing for trout, but the Sutom River region is known for something far more valuable than fish: gold. Illegal gold prospecting was everywhere in the area, and many believe that's what Alexei and Andrei were really after. When they reached the Amur region, they met 2 other men, Alexander Abdullaev and Viktor Komarov. These weren't close friends. They were acquaintances, fellow opportunists looking to strike it rich in the wilderness. The 4 men loaded their UAZ vehicle with supplies, tools, and equipment that suggested far more than a casual fishing expedition. They headed into the Sakha Republic, also known as Yakutia, one of the harshest environments on Earth. It's a frozen, unforgiving land where bears and wolves hunt freely, where temperatures can plummet to deadly lows in a matter of hours, and where local legends speak of Yeti-like creatures lurking in the endless forests. For men chasing gold, it seemed worth the risk. It wasn't. Day 1. The men drove deeper and deeper into the Siberian wilderness, following rough trails that barely qualified as roads. Yakutia is not a place that forgives mistakes. It's a region of extremes, where summer can feel endless, but winter arrives like a guillotine. Swift and lethal. They were confident. They had supplies. They had a vehicle. They had each other. But the wilderness doesn't care about confidence, and it certainly doesn't care about greed. Day 3. Disaster struck. Their UAZ vehicle, loaded with everything they needed to survive, plunged into a river and sank. Fishing gear, food, shelter, tools, all gone in an instant. Suddenly, 4 men stood stranded in the middle of nowhere with almost nothing. No GPS, no radio, no way to call for help. They made a decision: walk home. It was hundreds of kilometers through dense, unmapped forest, but it was the only option. So they started moving, pushing through the Siberian wilderness, with dwindling hope and growing fear. Day 7. The terrain was brutal. Rivers crisscrossed their path. Dense vegetation slowed them to a crawl, and Andrei injured his leg badly. The pain made every step agony. The group's pace dropped to almost nothing. Tensions began to rise. Food was running out. The weather was turning. And somewhere in those early days, the group made decisions that would seal their fates. By day 14, winter came early. In Yakutia, winter doesn't ease in. It slams down like a frozen hammer. Temperatures plummeted. Snow began to fall. The forest transformed from a difficult environment into a death trap. The men had no proper winter gear, no food, no communication with the outside world. They were alone, freezing, and desperate. They fried animal skins to eat. They chewed on moss and bark. They swallowed sawdust mixed with river water just to feel something in their stomachs. It wasn't enough. Starvation set in. By day 21, they tried to cross a frozen river and fell through the ice. Soaked in sub-zero temperatures, they crawled to shore and spent an entire day huddled by a fire, shivering, praying they wouldn't freeze to death before morning. Hypothermia should have killed them. Somehow, they survived. But survival came at a cost. Viktor, the quietest of the 4, began to slow down. Some reports suggest he was injured. Others say he was simply the weakest. What happened next remains unclear, but Viktor would never be seen again. By day 30, according to the story Alexei and Alexander would later tell, Viktor simply wandered off one night and disappeared. They claimed they searched for him, but found nothing. The Siberian wilderness had swallowed him whole, but investigators would come to believe something far darker, that Viktor didn't wander off, that he was the first to die, and that his body was the first to be consumed. By day 40, Andrei's condition worsened. His injured leg was infected. Frostbite had set in. He could barely walk. The group's pace slowed to almost nothing, and the hunger, the constant, gnawing, maddening hunger, became unbearable. In survival situations, the human body begins to eat itself. Muscles break down, organs weaken, the mind starts to fracture. Desperation turns rational men into something else entirely. By day 53, somewhere in the wilderness, in the frozen hell of the Siberian taiga, Andrei Kurochkin died. But he didn't freeze to death, though that's what his killers would claim. Forensic evidence would later reveal that he was struck in the head 3 times. 2 of those blows fractured his skull. Someone, most likely Alexei, possibly with Alexander's help, beat him to death with a blunt object. Maybe it was an argument over food. Maybe Andrei had discovered what happened to Viktor. Maybe desperation had simply turned into violence. Whatever the reason, Andrei was murdered, and then his body was butchered. For 30 days, Alexei and Alexander kept walking, but they weren't alone anymore. They were carrying pieces of Andrei with them. Human flesh, hacked from bones with an axe, stored, rationed, cooked over open fires, and eaten to stay alive. They traveled with their friend's remains, consuming him piece by piece as they pushed through the wilderness. The cannibalism wasn't a one-time act of desperation. It was sustained, calculated, and carried out over weeks. By day 140, the 2 men pushed forward, growing weaker but refusing to die. Back home, families had lost all contact. Calls went unanswered. Letters went undelivered. Anxiety turned to fear, then to certainty that something terrible had happened. By late November, search and rescue teams were mobilized. Helicopters swept over the Siberian wilderness. Ground teams moved through the snow, searching for any sign of the missing men. By day 147, at the end of November, rescuers finally found them. Alexei and Alexander were discovered emaciated, hollow-eyed, frostbitten, and barely able to stand. They looked like walking corpses, but they were alive. The rescuers asked the obvious question, where are the others? The survivors had their answer ready. They said they'd split up weeks ago. They claimed Andrei and Viktor had stayed behind at a hunter's cabin near the Dorka River while they pressed on to find help. They said they'd been separated for months and had no idea what happened to their friends. It was a plausible story. The Siberian wilderness is vast. People get separated. People die. It seemed like a tragic but understandable outcome. Rescuers prepared to search for the cabin and the 2 missing men. But then, right near the camp where Alexei and Alexander had been found, rescue teams made a discovery that shattered the entire narrative. They found human remains, not at a distant cabin, not in some far-off location. Right there, with the survivors, pieces of human flesh, bones with cut marks, evidence of butchery. The remains weren't hidden or abandoned. They were being carried, stored, transported as food. The lie collapsed instantly. There was no cabin where they'd left their friends. There was no separation. Alexei and Alexander had been traveling with human remains, eating their companion as they walked through the forest, day after day, mile after mile. They'd been caught red-handed with the evidence. Investigators brought Alexander back to the site by helicopter. They demanded the truth. Under pressure, Alexander confessed, but his confession was carefully crafted. He admitted to the cannibalism but framed it as survival. He said Andrei had died from the cold, that his injured leg had gotten worse, that frostbite had consumed him, that he'd simply frozen to death, and only after he was already dead did they make the impossible choice to eat him. They needed protein, Alexander explained. They cut flesh from his bones, cooked it over fires, and it kept them alive for 10 more days. It was horrifying, but in the context of extreme survival, it was defensible. People have done worse to stay alive. If Andrei had already died naturally, perhaps this was just the brutal reality of the Siberian wilderness. But the forensic experts weren't buying it. When they examined Andrei's remains, they found evidence that destroyed Alexander's story. Andrei had not frozen to death. He had been struck in the head 3 times with a blunt object. 2 of those blows had fractured his skull. The injuries were consistent with being beaten to death. Someone had killed him. The narrative of survival cannibalism, tragic but understandable, was replaced with something far darker. This was murder. Premeditated or not, Andrei had been killed, then butchered and eaten. And Viktor? He was never found. Not his body, not his bones, not a single trace. The official story was that he'd wandered off and disappeared. But investigators strongly suspected the truth was more sinister, given that Alexei and Alexander were found carrying human remains, and given the timeline of events, many believe Viktor was killed first, possibly even before Andrei. His body was likely consumed entirely, or discarded earlier in the journey, leaving nothing to recover. The wilderness kept that secret. 2 men had gone into the wilderness with Alexei and Alexander. Only pieces of one came back. The legal aftermath was a nightmare that exposed the gaps in Russian law. Prosecutors faced an immediate problem. There was no specific criminal statute against cannibalism. You cannot charge someone with eating human flesh if the law doesn't explicitly forbid it. So they charged Alexei with intentional infliction of grievous bodily harm, essentially assault causing death. It was a legal workaround, but a weak one. The court accepted Alexei's insistence that this wasn't murder or manslaughter, despite the forensic evidence of skull fractures and blunt force trauma, despite the butchered remains, despite everything. Alexei was convicted only of causing bodily harm. His sentence? 3.5 years. Suspended. He would serve no time behind bars. He walked free. Alexander wasn't even charged. He was treated as a witness, granted immunity in exchange for his testimony. He walked away without punishment, without consequences, without justice. The decision sparked outrage across Russia. Andrei's widow publicly expressed her shock and fury. She said nobody expected a cannibal to walk free with a suspended sentence. She called the investigation a failure, the verdict a travesty. She said her husband had been murdered, butchered, and eaten, and the men responsible were going home. Media coverage exploded. Russians were horrified, not just by the crime, but by the justice system's response. Many believed that Alexei's status as a former political figure and businessman had protected him, that his connections had bought him a light sentence, that corruption had triumphed over justice. The public pressure worked. Andrei's widow appealed the verdict. The prosecution, stung by the backlash, joined the appeal. The case went back to court, and this time, the judges took a harder line. They overturned the suspended sentence and replaced it with 12 years in a penal colony. Real prison time. Hard labor. Finally, it seemed, justice was being served. Alexei Gorulenko was ordered to report to custody to begin his sentence, but Alexei had no intention of serving 12 years in a Russian prison. Just before he was to be taken into custody, he vanished. He fled into the wilderness, the same Siberian landscape that had nearly killed him once before. For 10 years, Alexei lived as a fugitive, moving through remote fishing camps and abandoned houses across Russia's Far East and Siberia. He knew the land. He knew how to disappear. He became a ghost, living off the grid in places where police rarely ventured and locals asked no questions. He fished, he hunted, he survived. And he evaded capture year after year, becoming almost a legend, the cannibal who escaped. In 2024, 12 years after the crime, Alexei made a mistake. He tried to visit a relative in a village near Saratov, far from his usual hiding places. Someone recognized him, maybe a local who'd seen his face on the news years ago, maybe a tip from someone who knew his identity. Police moved in quickly. After a decade on the run, Alexei Gorulenko was finally apprehended. The man who had survived 147 days in the Siberian wilderness, who had eaten his friends, who had beaten the justice system once and fled before it could catch him again, was back in custody. This time, there would be no escape. But Andrei's widow never got the answers she deserved. She never learned exactly how her husband died, or why. She never got to bury his complete remains. Viktor's family never recovered his body. They never got closure. Somewhere in the Siberian taiga, scattered under snow or consumed entirely, the fourth man's remains were lost forever. The Siberian wilderness is a place where the rules of civilization don't apply, where desperation can twist men into monsters, where gold fever can lead to murder, and where the truth is sometimes more terrifying than any legend. What happened out there in those 147 days will never be fully known. But the bones, what's left of them, tell a story that words cannot hide. And Alexei Gorulenko, sitting in a cell today, carries that story with him forever.